The winter of 1944 found much of Europe scarred by fortifications lines of trenches, belts of barbed wire, and reinforced bunkers built to withstand artillery and deny infantry any easy advance. Every major army had learned, through painful experience, that concrete was cheaper than blood. Bunkers multiplied across ridges, road junctions, and forested high ground. Some were complex, multi-chambered structures with interlocking lines of fire. Others were crude but effective, carved directly into hillsides or reinforced with layers of timber and packed soil. What they shared was simple. They were built to stop men armed only with rifles, grenades, and courage. The Allied push through these obstacles often moved yard by yard. Infantry battalions were repeatedly forced to clear defensive pockets that refused to yield. Machine gun ports, camouflaged embrasures, and cleverly sited interlocking fields of fire meant that even a single bunker could halt an entire company. Reports from frontline commanders spoke of platoons pinned down by a single MGF-42 nest, its high rate of fire slicing through the fog and brush with terrifying precision. To break these stalemates, specialized weapons returned to the forefront, tools originally developed in World War I but refined for the harsher, more mechanized conflict of the 1940s. Among them was the man-portable flamethrower. Heavy, slow, and dangerous to the operator, it was nonetheless one of the few tools capable of reaching into a fortified position and forcing defenders out. Fire was not only lethal, it was psychologically devastating. Heat, pressure, and choking smoke overwhelmed positions that even explosives could not reliably neutralize. Yet despite this grim effectiveness, flamethrowers inspired distrust among infantry. They were cumbersome. They made their operators targets. And early designs, with their vulnerable fuel tanks and temperamental ignition systems, caused many soldiers to treat them with the same respect they might give unstable explosives. Crews received specialized training. They learned to move low, avoid silhouetting themselves, and only approach strong points under covering fire. Even so, flamethrower teams suffered high casualties in almost every major engagement. In the months before the Ridge assault, the unit tasked with clearing the bunker had received a new model. Shorter, more compact, a design stripped down for mobility rather than raw output. It lacked the intimidating bulk of earlier versions, and more than one infantryman had dismissed it with a shrug. A toy, some muttered. Too small. Too light. A poor match for thick concrete and hardened embrasures. But commanders understood a truth that many at the front did not. A flamethrower was not merely a tool of destruction. It was a weapon of pressure. Its presence alone altered the calculation of defenders. It forced movement. It forced mistakes. And in the narrow corridors of a bunker, even a small burst of flame could fill the space faster than any grenade. By early January, reconnaissance patrols confirmed the presence of a reinforced bunker complex overlooking a vital approach route. The structure was dug into the ridge with a clear line of fire over the valley floor. Attempts to outflank it had been met with machine gun bursts and well-placed mortar fire. Several assaults stalled before they could even reach the outer wire. Reports described interlocking trenches, a steel-lined firing chamber, and a concealed rear entrance allowing the defenders to rotate crews and bring up ammunition. It became clear that the position could not simply be bypassed. Its field of fire covered the approach to the next village, an objective that battalion command needed secured before armoured elements could advance. Neutralising the bunker meant opening a path for the broader offensive. So the task fell to a mixed group of infantry and combat engineers. They would approach before dawn, use the fog to cross the open ground, breach the outer defences, and clear the bunker room by room. Standard assault doctrine called for demolitions and grenades, but intelligence suggested the defenders had sealed inner blast doors. A flamethrower might be the only way to drive them back or render the compartment unsafe. Leadership assigned the new toy model to the assault team, trusting its compact frame to provide mobility in tight terrain. Soldiers exchanged doubtful glances. Some worried it lacked the fuel capacity. Others doubted its ignition reliability in cold weather. But the order stood. What mattered now was the approach closing the distance to a fortified structure that had already halted several attempts. And as the men prepared for the assault, a quiet understanding settled over them. Someone would have to carry the weapon forward, exposed into the narrow killing zone at the bunker's edge. That weight shifted the atmosphere in the trench, setting the conditions that shaped everything that followed. The ridge itself was a natural barrier, steep, uneven, and covered in a mix of bare winter brush and scattered pines. Snow clung to the shaded folds of the slope, turning the ground into a slick, unpredictable surface that slowed every movement. At its crest, the German bunker complex sat with deliberate advantage. Engineers had carved it into the hillside months earlier, anchoring it deep in compacted earth and reinforced concrete. Its embrasures were angled to cover the valley floor, and its firing arcs overlapped with a secondary position hidden farther along the ridge. Any frontal approach would place attackers directly within the field of fire of both positions. Allied commanders studied aerial photographs that showed dark slits and shadowed shapes in the hillside. Interpreters marked suspected machine gun nests and ammunition stores, but even the clearest reconnaissance could not reveal the bunker's interior. Reports from local civilians suggested German work crews had expanded the position through the autumn, adding timber supports and internal partitions to help withstand fragmentation from grenades or artillery. It would take more than a single blast to cripple it. The battalion tasked with clearing the ridge had already absorbed casualties from earlier probes. Platoon leaders knew the challenge ahead. Crossing open terrain under observation, breaching well-prepared defenses, and forcing entry into a confined structure where defenders had every advantage. The mix of infantry and engineers assembled for the pre-dawn assault represented men drawn from multiple companies, some veterans of previous operations. Others recently arrived replacements still adjusting to the realities of frontline combat. They gathered in a sheltered fold of ground near the forward trench network. A map board stood propped against a crate, weighted with stones to keep it from tipping in the cold wind. Red grease pencil lines indicated the planned approach route. The path curved through a shallow depression that offered partial cover before rising toward the bunker's lower flank. Engineers would precede the main body to cut wire obstacles and mark safe lanes with small stakes. Riflemen would follow in bounding movements to suppress any defenders who attempted to fire from the embrasures. Silence dominated the briefing, broken only by the occasional cough or the clicking of a rifle bolt being checked for the third or fourth time. The man assigned to the flamethrower stood near the rear of the group. His equipment had been inspected twice already, fuel tanks tested for leaks, and igniter coils carefully wrapped to protect against the damp air. The compact design allowed him slightly more freedom of movement than earlier models, but the weight still pressed heavily across his shoulders. Despite its modest appearance, everyone understood one thing. If the demolitions team failed to breach the bunker's interior doors, or if defenders took cover in deeper chambers, the flamethrower would become the decisive tool. Its presence meant the difference between a stalemate and a cleared position. Shortly after the briefing, scouts moved ahead to listen for activity along the ridge. They reported the muffled sound of boots shifting inside the bunker, evidence that the defenders were awake, alert, and likely aware that an attack was coming. German doctrine emphasized early readiness in fortified positions, and it was clear these troops were no exception. Artillery support for the assault would be limited. High explosive fire risked collapsing the hillside and burying the main entrance. Commanders wanted the bunker neutralized, not destroyed, so that captured documents or equipment could be recovered. This meant the infantry would bear the primary burden, pushing close enough to use grenades, satchel charges, and if necessary the flamethrower, to force the defenders out. By the final hour before dawn, the attack order was confirmed. Runners moved along the trench, relaying the timeline. Men adjusted packs, tightened straps, and lowered their helmet straps against the wind. The assault group formed into its designated order, each man knowing the precise sequence that would unfold on the slope. When the signal came, they would rise from the safety of the trench and enter the open ground, cold air filling their lungs. Boots crunching across frozen soil, rifles held ready. They knew the first bursts from the bunker would likely erupt before they were halfway across. They knew the slope offered little shelter. But they also knew that clearing this ridge was essential, a necessary step toward the wider objectives waiting beyond. And deep in the ranks, the man carrying the so-called toy shifted his weight and exhaled slowly, aware that his moment would come when all other options narrowed into a single, deadly task. That silent anticipation set the stage for understanding the many angles, human, tactical, technological, and psychological, that shaped what unfolded next. For the infantry on the slope, the coming assault was more than a tactical maneuver. It was a test of nerve, shaped by countless small decisions made in darkness. Each man carried his own quiet calculations. Veterans measured the distance to the bunker's field of fire by instinct, recalling similar approaches in earlier campaigns. Replacements studied the ground with the tense focus of men trying to memorize a lethal geometry they barely understood. The shared silence before the attack spoke volumes. These were soldiers who had learned that even the best plan dissolved once the first rounds cracked overhead. Among them, the flamethrower operator bore a different kind of pressure. Flamethrower crews were uniquely exposed. Their bulkier silhouette drew attention. Their role demanded they close distance rather than keep it. Even seasoned infantrymen found themselves glancing towards such operators with a mix of respect and apprehension. Everyone understood the risks. Enemy fire gravitated toward the flame tank's silhouette. A single hit to the fuel containers, though often exaggerated in soldiers' lore, still carried obvious danger. And once the operator engaged, he would be operating in the narrow threshold between bunker and trencher place, where seconds mattered. The man assigned to this model had volunteered on previous operations. He understood the weight not only of the apparatus, but of expectation. Flamethrowers rarely had second chances. Either their first burst broke the defender's will, or the operator was forced to withdraw under fire, a retreat that invited greater danger. As he checked his straps and adjusted the hose, he knew his moment would come only after others had fallen prone under machine gun bursts, after engineers had cut through the wire, after grenades had been thrown and explosions shook the earth. His task began where others ended. That knowledge pressed on him more heavily than the fuel tanks across his back. The assault on a fortified bunker followed a rhythm shaped by doctrine and experience. Commanders understood that frontal attacks on hardened positions were among the most costly actions an infantry company could undertake. German bunkers were not passive obstacles, they were active. Coordinated defensive systems built to channel, delay, and inflict. Machine guns covered likely approach routes. Mortars stood ready to fire on fixed patterns pre-registered onto the slope. And defensive infantry inside the bunker prepared to rotate firing crews to keep weapons functioning even under suppressive fire. To overcome such positions, Allied forces relied on precise sequencing. Engineers moved first, cutting wire and marking safe lanes. Riflemen followed in bounding teams, delivering suppressive fire to force defenders to keep their heads down. Close assault troops advanced with grenades, demolition charges, and when needed, flamethrowers. Each step required synchronization. A stumble in one element could unravel the entire assault. Yet even the best coordinated plan depended on timing, terrain, and luck. The slope leading to the bunker offered little natural cover, and any pause could expose attackers to the full volume of defensive fire. Machine gun crews inside the bunker would wait for the moment when silhouetted figures crested shallow rises or crossed small clearings. Their first bursts were often the most lethal. For the flamethrower operator, tactical reality demanded he arrive at the bunker's entrance uninjured and with enough fuel remaining to deliver decisive bursts. But reaching the structure required suppressors to keep the embrasures silent. It required smoke to obscure movement. It required engineers to breach obstacles under fire. Without these supporting elements, the flamethrower was useless, a heavy, vulnerable burden. Every man in the assault line knew the plan's fragile balance. And as the briefing ended, they understood that the ridge would test every assumption they carried into the fight. The flamethrower, strapped to the operator's back, represented years of incremental refinement rather than dramatic innovation. Early war models were notoriously heavy, approaching 30 kilograms when fully loaded. They used bulky tanks and unreliable ignition systems that sometimes failed in cold weather or damp environments. Crews learned to carry spare ignitors wrapped in cloth and tucked inside jacket pockets. Fuel mixtures varied, but many relied on thickened gasoline or specialized compounds designed to adhere to surfaces. The newer model issued for this assault was compact by comparison. Engineers had reduced its profile, lightened the tank assembly, and improved the ignition system with a more dependable spark setup. The hose was shorter, easier to maneuver in confined spaces. Fuel capacity was limited, but the design accepted this trade-off to enhance mobility. In theory, it was ideal for assaulting smaller fortifications or clearing interior chambers where room to maneuver was scarce. Its appearance, however, led some infantrymen to dismiss it. Without the imposing bulk of older designs, it seemed less formidable a laner, almost delicate apparatus. Soldiers accustomed to judging equipment by size had trouble trusting a flamethrower that looked understated. They had seen older models project long, heavy bursts of flame. They doubted this compact system could match that intensity. Yet field tests showed otherwise. The reduced profile allowed operators to move faster, crouch lower, and expose less of their body when approaching strong points. The improved ignition made misfires less likely. And in close quarters, the shorter hose actually improved accuracy and control. Engineers recognized its purpose. Not to dominate open ground, but to deliver fire precisely where it mattered, through a firing slit, into a doorway, or down the narrow corridor of a bunker. It was a tool built for focused lethality rather than spectacle, and the coming assault would reveal just how decisive that design choice could be. The decision to deploy a flamethrower in an assault was never taken lightly. Company and platoon commanders understood both its strength and its vulnerability. Flamethrowers could break entrenched defenses that had repelled repeated infantry pushes, but their use required careful timing. Early employment risked exposing the operator before supporting elements were in place. Late employment meant casualties accumulated while waiting for a weapon capable of ending the stalemate. Choosing the right moment mattered. Leadership on the ridge examined reconnaissance reports, battlefield geometry, and the limits of available fire support. They knew artillery could not be used freely. They knew the bunker's embrasures were positioned to rake the slope with overlapping fire. And they knew that a direct approach, unsupported, would grind the assault before it reached the entrance. The compact flamethrower model drew interest precisely because it offered speed. A faster operator could exploit temporary suppression, moving in the seconds between machine gun bursts. Coordination between engineers, rifle squads, and the flamethrower operator became central to the plan. Leaders issued clear sequencing orders. Engineers would advance under covering fire, breach obstacles, and mark lanes. Rifle squads would suppress the embrasures until the flamethrower reached position. The timing had to be exact. Any deviation could expose the operator or allow defenders to recover. Behind these tactical calculations lay a human recognition. Men would be risking their lives in a narrow margin of minutes. Leaders understood it, respected it, and carried the responsibility quietly. The choice to use the flamethrower was not about spectacle, it was about necessity, shaped by terrain, enemy preparation, and the unforgiving realities of bunker assaults. For the German defenders inside the ridge bunker, the assault did not begin with explosions or shouting. It began with soft movements on the slope, muted clinks of metal, distant rustling carried by the wind. Experienced soldiers learned to sense these moments. They tightened grips on weapon stocks. They adjusted firing slits. They exchanged brief, wordless glances in the dim interior light. The bunker was cramped but functional. Machine gun crews positioned themselves behind steel-lined embrasures, their sights trained toward the slope. Ammunition boxes sat stacked in corners, ready for rotation. Ventilation shafts allowed air to circulate, but the interior air remained heavy, tinged with oil and cold concrete. Defenders knew the value of their position. It covered the approach route. It held a commanding view of the valley. Losing it would open the ridge and expose the line behind them. German doctrine emphasized discipline in fortified positions. Crews practiced maintaining steady rates of fire to avoid overheating barrels. They prepared grenades to roll down approach routes if attackers reached the wire. They knew assault troops could slip into blind spots beneath the firing arcs. Yet there remained one threat above all others, one weapon that every defender feared more than grenades or rifles: flame. Reports from other sectors had circulated for months. Accounts of flamethrower assaults spread quickly among units. Defenders described searing heat flooding firing chambers, smoke filling ventilation ducts, the terror of fire entering confined spaces. Even knowing flamethrowers had limited range, the psychological effect was immediate. The possibility alone could force defenders to abandon positions or fall back deeper into the structure. As the first shadows moved on the slope, the defenders tightened their grips and focused on the embrasures, unaware that a compact flamethrower, the one dismissed as a toy, would soon test the limits of their air. Defenses, while few weapons in the Second World War carried the same psychological weight as the flamethrower. Its effect was visceral. Soldiers on both sides recognized that flame changed the emotional landscape of combat. Grenades, bullets, and shells were deadly, but flame introduced panic heat, smoke, and the fear of being trapped. In enclosed spaces like bunkers, these effects amplified tenfold. For attackers, operating a flamethrower meant accepting a dual burden. They carried a weapon that could end a defensive stand, but they also bore the knowledge of its effects. Many operators wrote about the difficulty of using flame in close quarters, aware of the suffering it caused. They understood it was a weapon of last resort, used only when all other options failed to dislodge defenders entrenched behind concrete and steel. That moral weight stayed with them long after battles concluded. For defenders, the psychological impact was immediate and overwhelming. Even the sound of an igniter sparking outside a firing slit could trigger fear. In narrow chambers, flame behaved unpredictably, creating pressure waves of heat and smoke. The threat could compel seasoned soldiers to abandon positions that had withstood artillery. It shattered the sense of safety that bunkers otherwise afforded. This psychological dimension shaped the ridge assault long before the first flame burst. The mere presence of the weapon compact or not created possibilities in the minds of both sides. It altered decisions, tightened nerves, and defined the stakes of the coming moments. All of these angles, human, tactical, technological, leadership, enemy, and moral, converged on the same point: the narrow stretch of frozen ground between the forward trench and the bunker entrance. It was here that the decisive moment would unfold, where the so-called toy would face the reality of fortified war. The signal came just as the first thin line of sun pushed over the ridge, faint and cold. A single flare arced upward from the company command post, its muted trail dissolving into the morning haze. The assault group rose from the trench almost as one, boots scraping against frozen earth, shoulders tightening beneath their packs. For a brief moment, the world held still. No gunfire, no shouting, only the crunch of movement as the line shifted forward. They advanced into the shallow depression that marked the beginning of the approach route. Engineers led the way, crouched low, wire cutters held ready. The slope ahead curved gently upward, its surface broken only by patches of frostbitten brush. The bunker itself remained out of sight behind the incline, hidden but ever present in the minds of the men climbing toward it. Halfway across the open ground, the first burst of machine gun fire ripped through the cold air. The sound was sharp, metallic, unmistakable. A single MG42 opened from the right embrasure, its barrel already trained on the shallow depression. Rounds tore into the soil, kicking up splinters of earth and sending the assault line sprawling for cover. Riflemen dropped into firing positions. Engineers pressed themselves against the frozen ground, wire cutters momentarily forgotten as they evaluated their next move. Suppressive fire erupted from the trench behind them, rifle and machine gun bursts aimed at the embrasures. A second German gun answered, its firing arc sweeping across the slope in a tight, disciplined pattern. The defenders inside the bunker had reacted quickly, their barrels already warmed by pre-dawn readiness drills. Pinned down, the assault group relied on rehearsed discipline. Squads shifted into firing lines, trading bursts with the defenders to buy the engineers time. The wire obstacles sat just meters ahead, dark lines of twisted metal partially buried beneath frost. They had to be cleared before anyone could reach the bunker mouth. An engineer team crawled forward under covering fire, clippers working rapidly through the first strand. Machine gun bursts hammered the slope. One round struck a nearby rock, sending a spray of fragments across the ground. Still the team worked, cutting a narrow passage that would allow riflemen to slip through without snagging gear or exposing themselves. Behind them, the flamethrower operator advanced in short, controlled movements. He kept his profile low, the compact tanks clinging tightly to his back. Each time a machine gun burst swept the slope, he paused, pressing himself into the earth until the firing shifted away. His heartbeat matched the staccato rhythm of distant gunfire, a reminder that every step forward carried an increasing price. The engineers cleared the final strand of wire just as another burst raked the depression. A rifleman to their left shouted a warning, pointing toward a glint of metal deeper along the ridge, another position, partially concealed, joining the fight. The assault group responded with immediate suppressive fire. Rifles cracked in rapid succession. The plan's timing had begun to degrade. Smoke was called for. A forward sergeant signaled the rear, and within seconds, smoke grenades arced overhead, landing across the slope in a staggered pattern. Thick grey plumes rose and drifted, caught by the wind blowing across the hillside. It wasn't perfect cover, but it was enough to obscure movement enough to push forward before the defenders could adjust their aim. Through the shifting haze, the bunker's outline finally appeared. A squat concrete shape emerging from the hillside, its right embrasure spitting intermittent bursts. The entrance lay several meters to the left, a narrow, reinforced doorway partially shielded by earth. That doorway represented the objective. It was the threshold where grenades, demolitions and flame would determine the fight. The first assault team moved toward it, sprinting in broken strides, using smoke as their shield. German machine gunners adjusted angles, firing blind into the haze. Shots cracked overhead, some thudding into packs, others skimming the ground. A rifleman stumbled as a round grazed his shoulder but continued moving, driven by momentum and training. Behind this first group, the flamethrower operator prepared for his advance. He checked the hose alignment, ensured the igniter coil remained dry, and tightened his grip on the wand. The smoke granted a fleeting window-only seconds to reach the bunker wall and position himself for the decisive burst. Engineers reached the bunker entrance first. Their task was to clear any obstacles, check for tripwires, and prepare grenades. But as they approached the doorway, a sudden blast from inside sent dust and fragments outward. The defenders had thrown a grenade of their own, aiming to disrupt the final approach. The explosion shook the entrance, knocking one engineer backward and momentarily scattering the team. It was in that chaos that the importance of the flamethrower became unmistakable. Riflemen attempted to suppress both embrasures with concentrated fire, but the defenders rotated crews with practiced precision. The firing did not stop. The grenades' blast complicated the breach. Grenades alone would not clear the chamber behind the steel door. And the smoke already thinning would not hold forever. The moment the plan had anticipated and feared arrived. The flamethrower operator rose to his feet, taking a deep breath as he moved toward the entrance. Riflemen shifted their positions to cover him, firing deliberately into the embrasures to pull attention away. Engineers regained footing and prepared to follow. He advanced toward the concrete wall, closing the last meters under fire, knowing that once he reached the threshold, the weapon on his back would shape the next seconds of the battle. The decisive moment was about to begin. The first burst had done more than scorch the entrance. It had exposed the bunker's greatest vulnerability, its need to breathe. German fortifications of this type relied on a combination of vent shafts and angled corridors to keep air moving and prevent choking from spent cartridges. When flame entered those spaces, it didn't simply burn. It consumed the oxygen the bunker depended on. Inside, the defenders instinctively pulled back, coughing as smoke poured through the firing slit. A machine gunner tried to swing his weapon toward the entrance again, but the internal haze distorted his sight picture. His rounds smacked uselessly into the outer parapet, carving splinters from logs already blackened by heat. Another man shouted for someone to get grenades to the forward pit. But sound inside a burning bunker becomes chaotic, every voice flattened, every order drowned under the low roar of suffocating fire. Outside, the flamethrower operator didn't wait. He knew the window was short. He advanced 5 more steps, pausing behind a stump that had been severed earlier by artillery. The assistant gunner kept low, feeding slack hose, steadying the tank. In training, the manuals emphasized teamwork. The operator controls the stream, but the assistant keeps the unit alive, monitoring pressure, shielding the tank from fire, keeping the line untangled. Many war accounts describe these pairs as 2 men operating on a single heartbeat. He steadied his stance. Then he fired again. This time, the flame entered at a downward angle, following the natural slope of the bunker's hallway. Fuel splashed along the planks, igniting instantly. A rolling wave of fire pushed inward like liquid light. The interior temperature rose in seconds. Testimonies from both Allied and German sources speak of bunkers reaching hundreds of degrees in moments, turning the inside into an oven long before the flame ever physically reached the defenders. A German soldier tried to slam his shoulder against the inner door to seal the passage, but the hinges had swollen from heat. Wood expanded. Smoke thickened. The corridor was now a funnel, and the flame exploited every inch of it. Outside, the bunker itself began to change color. Black became red. Red became dull orange. Thin lines of smoke curled through the seams between timbers as tar and pitch boiled underneath. Infantry along the slope felt the shift. Their mockery was gone. Their earlier doubt replaced by something bordering on disbelief. The toy, as they'd called it, was doing what mortar rounds and rifle fire had failed to do for days: neutralize a hardened strongpoint without a frontal infantry charge. But the bunker was not yet finished. A burst of automatic fire suddenly snapped out from the right-hand embrasure, the secondary firing slit. The defenders were attempting a final effort to keep the assault at bay. Rounds hissed over the soil, cutting splinters from tree roots and forcing several soldiers to flatten into the earth. The assistant gunner ducked reflexively, dragging the fuel hose with him. The operator pulled back behind a mound, feeling the sudden shift in weight as the hose tightened. The flamethrower's greatest weakness was now exposed. It turned its user into the most valuable and most vulnerable target on the battlefield. The German gunner knew exactly what he was aiming at. If he could hit the tank, the assault might end instantly. Contrary to popular myth, most tanks didn't explode when pierced, but a ruptured canister meant a death sentence for the operator and his partner. The assistant shouted for him to move left out of the gunner's line of sight. The operator crawled through the cold mud, dragging the cumbersome hose across roots and stones. The tanks clanged softly as they brushed against the ground. Each movement had to be deliberate. Any sudden jerk risked twisting the igniter line or bending the nozzle. Then, in the split-second silence between bursts of MG fire, another sound cut through. A grenade detonating inside the bunker. One of the trapped defenders, unable to escape the smoke, had pulled the pin too close to the flame-weakened interior. Shrapnel ricocheted inside the cramped space. The secondary firing slit went dark. The machine gun fell silent. The operator rose to one knee. He knew the moment had come, the final surge. He stepped out from behind the mound, aiming directly into the heart of the bunker's main entrance. The ignition clicked. Pressure surged. A third stream of fire roared forward, heavier than the first two, longer, hotter, and aimed with absolute commitment. The arc of flame entered the bunker and vanished into the darkness, but its effect was immediate. A column of thick black smoke burst upward from one of the rear vent shafts like a signal flare. Another vent popped with a muffled thump as the internal air superheated. The bunker was dying. Infantry spread along the line could see it clearly. The structure that had dominated the ridgeline, blocking their advance, endangering every patrol. Resisting bombardments, was beginning to sag under its own failing supports. Flames licked through the timbers. The sharp crack of splitting wood echoed across the clearing. Then came the final sign. A single German soldier staggered out of the side exit, coughing violently, hands raised, uniform smouldering. He collapsed in the frost, unable to speak. Moments later, another emerged, stumbling through the smoke. There would be no counterattack, no last stand, no machine gun resetting for another burst. Inside, the remaining defenders were either incapacitated or fleeing through the emergency crawl tunnels that connected the bunker to a rear trench network. Some managed to escape. Many did not. The ridge fell silent except for the faint hiss of cooling metal and the distant rumble of artillery on another sector of the front. The operator lowered the nozzle slowly, letting the tank settle against his back. His assistant exhaled for the first time in nearly a minute. And as the smoke drifted upward through the tree line, the infantry realized what they were witnessing. The moment a dismissed, underestimated weapon shifted the balance of an entire frontline position. A weapon mocked only hours earlier had just cleared a fortification that conventional firepower could not dislodge. And the consequences of that breakthrough would ripple far beyond this burned-out ridge. When the smoke finally thinned, the ridge revealed a landscape transformed. The bunker, once a low, angular silhouette of timber, soil, and reinforced firing chambers, was now a charred cavity in the hillside. Its outer logs had collapsed inward, warped into blackened ribs. The air still shimmered with heat, drifting upward in faint waves that distorted the view of the tree line beyond. Medics moved first, stepping carefully across the uneven earth. Their task was not victory, but triage, pulling the wounded from shallow craters, checking for breathing, dragging the exhausted clear of lingering fumes. A few surviving German defenders lay in the frost, coughing violently as medics offered canteens or simply kept them from rolling back toward the burning structure. War had its rituals, and one of them was that even enemies pulled from fire were still human. Meanwhile, infantry officers began assessing what had just happened. They walked the perimeter, examining the bunker's construction with the sober curiosity of men studying a problem that had resisted them for weeks. The embrasures were reinforced, angled to deflect incoming fire. The overhead cover had been layered with logs and compacted soil thick enough to stop small-caliber rounds. The interior depth indicated a multi-chambered layout standard for mid-war German defensive architecture. But the design had one fatal flaw: narrow entrances and limited ventilation. A weakness few considered until a flamethrower exploited it with brutal efficiency. The platoon commander approached the flamethrower operator and his assistant. Their tanks were now empty, heavy, but harmless. Soot coated the operator's gloves. His face was streaked with the grey film of burned fuel. He didn't speak much. Men who used flamethrowers rarely did after an action. There was a strange quiet that followed each mission, as if the violence of the weapon left little space for words. Nearby, some infantrymen exchanged glances. Only that morning they had laughed at the Devassees, calling it a toy. A backpack lighter, a death wish on straps. Now those same men watched the operator with a different expression. Not admiration. Not fear. Something between respect and uncertainty. The kind of look men give to a weapon they suddenly understand. By midday, engineers arrived to finish clearing the ridge. They probed the structure for booby traps, removed unexploded munitions, and widened the entrance so the interior could cool. The smell inside lingered: burned timber, scorched fuel, the metallic tang of heated steel. Reports from similar bunker clearances across Europe described the same odor, one that clung to uniforms long after the fight ended. Once secure, the ridge became a temporary forward post. Maps were unrolled on makeshift tables. Patrol routes were recalculated. Supply lines were updated. And each of those changes traced back to the same moment: the extinguishing of the bunker. Higher command took immediate note. In after-action reports, officers highlighted the effectiveness of the flamethrower team. Not in dramatic terms, but in the dry, clipped language of military documentation phrases like bunker neutralized by flame or enemy resistance collapsed following fuel discharge. Such entries appeared again and again in the margins of wartime records whenever fortified positions were taken with minimal infantry losses. The tactical implications were clear. Where artillery struggled to penetrate, where grenades bounced off angled beams, where machine gun fire merely chipped wood, a flamethrower properly used ended the problem. But consequences extended beyond the immediate tactical gain. With the bunker gone, German forces along the sector shifted. Patrols withdrew to secondary positions. Fields of fire were recalibrated to account for the gap in the defensive line. Radio intercepts later confirmed that the loss of the bunker forced upon a reallocation of manpower from an adjacent ridge, weakening German depth across a wider area. The ridge, once locked in stalemate, had opened. A corridor for movement now existed where none had before. The infantry could advance not far, not immediately, but enough to matter. And behind that movement was the memory of the morning's fire, still rising faintly from the smouldering timber. The aftermath was not just structural. It was psychological. On both sides. Because for every soldier who witnessed the bunker's fall, one truth had become impossible to ignore. A dismissed weapon, misunderstood, mocked, and feared in equal measure, had just demonstrated a power no one on that ridge would forget. And that growing understanding would shape what happened next. As the day wore on, the ridge settled into an uneasy stillness. The worst of the smoke had drifted into the treetops, leaving behind only a faint haze that clung to the ground like morning fog refusing to lift. Soldiers moved across the clearing with a sense of subdued momentum, clearing debris, stacking ammunition, re-establishing communication lines. Victory here did not spark celebration. It simply allowed the war to continue a little farther forward. News of the bunker's fall travelled quickly down the battalion line. Officers tracing the front on their maps understood the significance. This bunker had anchored a small but strategically placed German position overlooking a natural choke point. For days, each attempted approach had been repelled with disciplined machine gun fire. Mortars had softened the perimeter, but the internal structure proved too deep, too well protected. Then, in under 5 minutes, the flamethrower team had accomplished what sustained bombardment could not. The contrast drew attention. Later that evening, a group of engineers knelt near the burned-out entrance, sketching its internal layout for intelligence reports. They documented the scorched angles of the embrasures, the collapsed inner chamber, and the vent shaft that had released the plume of black smoke. The moment many realized the bunker's fate had been sealed. The engineers' conclusions aligned with what post-war studies would confirm. Enclosed defensive structures, no matter how reinforced, were inherently vulnerable to internal ignition once flame breached their outer layer. The bunker's fall became one more example in a growing catalogue of similar engagements across the European theatre, where flamethrower units played decisive roles in clearing pillboxes, blockhouses, and fortified cellars. Historians later noted that despite their controversial reputation, flame units often reduced casualties among assaulting infantry by eliminating the need for close-quarters charges. On this ridge, the principle had been proven yet again. But the aftermath extended deeper than tactical reassessment. Among the German prisoners taken from the ridge, a pattern emerged in their accounts. Many spoke not of the bombardments or rifle fire, but of the sudden, suffocating surge of heat within the bunker, the way oxygen seemed to vanish as flames rolled down the corridor. One prisoner described feeling the air turn to ash. Another said the flames came like water poured into a bucket. Fear of flamethrowers was not a myth. It was a physiological response to a weapon that altered air itself. Even among the Allied soldiers, the emotional weight lingered. Flamethrower operators lived with a particular duality, indispensable in assaults, yet isolated by the nature of their task. After the bunker was cleared, the operator sat quietly on an ammunition crate, waiting for his tanks to cool before they could be detached. Several men approached him not with the earlier teasing, but with quiet nods or brief, awkward words. Respect replaced ridicule. Yet the operator didn't revel in it. He simply wiped the soot from his sleeves and stared toward the tree line, where the last curls of smoke still rose. Military planners took note of such moments. Commanders understood that morale was shaped not only by victories, but by the tools used to achieve them. A weapon capable of clearing a bunker without exposing an entire platoon to machine gun fire altered the calculus of future operations. Requests for additional flame teams increased across multiple sectors. Training manuals were updated. Assault tactics evolved. That night, as the men dug in around the newly secured ridge, the air carried the dull scent of burned timber. Lanterns flickered in shallow dugouts. Radios crackled with intermittent chatter as units coordinated their next moves. War rarely allowed time for contemplation, but several soldiers found themselves glancing toward the ruined bunker, still faintly glowing from within. It stood as a stark reminder of the thin line separating dominance from vulnerability on the battlefield. The ridge no longer felt like a place under siege. It felt like ground reclaimed, but at a cost measured in more than fuel and timber. In the days that followed, patrols moved beyond the ridge, confirming that the enemy had withdrawn to secondary lines. The bunker became little more than a burnt landmarker point on a map, now shaded in friendly colors. Yet its imprint lingered far longer in memory than in strategy. Long after the embers died, soldiers on both sides would recall the moment fire entered a fortified space built to withstand everything except the one thing it could not repel. And amid the cold, still air of that ridge, one truth remained clear. The flamethrower had rewritten the terms of engagement not through intimidation or myth, but through the undeniable reality of what it had accomplished in the quiet that followed. Long after the ridge had been logged in reports and folded into the larger movements of the front, the memory of that single bunker endured. Not because it was the largest, not because it held the most men, but because of what its destruction revealed about modern war. Throughout history, armies built walls believing they could outlast whatever the enemy brought against them. Stone repelled arrows. Timber absorbed musket fire. Concrete endured shells. But in the mechanized wars of the 20th century, the contest shifted. It was no longer just about strength of material, but about understanding its weaknesses and exploiting them with precision. The flamethrower embodied that shift. A crude, heavy, hazardous machine in the eyes of many soldiers, yet engineered around a simple truth. Even the strongest bunker relies on air, and anything that consumes that air can break the defenders inside. Its effectiveness was not rooted in spectacle, but in physics. Heat, pressure, oxygen forces indifferent to bravery or fortification. For the men on that ridge, the lesson was immediate. They saw how quickly a seemingly invulnerable position could collapse when confronted with a weapon designed for the specific purpose of denying refuge. And they understood, perhaps more deeply than they expected, that technology's role in war was more than steel and firepower. It was about altering the environment in which a battle took place. For historians, the moment reflected a broader story repeated across countless strongpoints from Normandy to the Pacific. Small, overlooked tools could tip the balance when used with skill and timing. Not because they were feared, but because they were designed for a role nothing else could fulfill. And for the flamethrower operator, quiet, soot-stained, and carrying a burden no one else wished to bear, the bunker became another chapter in a long chain of battles fought in the shadows of fortifications. A reminder that victory sometimes hinged not on the largest guns, but on the willingness of one or two men to step forward with a device others dismissed. When the last smoke faded from the ridge and the war moved onward, the lesson remained. Even the smallest weapon, underestimated and mocked, can reshape the field when its moment arrives.